Welcome back to Horror Cow Stories. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're spending the whole video in one part of the country, and that's the Appalachian region. West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Western North Carolina, the parts of Virginia and Tennessee that the interstates skip right over. These small village and holler communities have stories that don't make the news, and that's exactly why people send them to us. Let's read. Story 1. I want to start with the part that still bothers me most. It wasn't that I saw two children standing at the edge of my property after dark. It was that, when I walked away from them, I never heard them leave. I live in rural Clay County, West Virginia, on about 7 acres that have been in my family for 2 generations. There's a garden, some chickens, a few goats, and an old fence along the northern edge of the property. The neighboring families have been there much longer than mine. Some of them can trace their land back 4 or 5 generations, and there are things they know about the hills that aren't written down anywhere. I'm not one of those people. I've lived there 6 years, and I'm still technically an outsider. My nearest neighbor to the north is an older man whose family has been on that property longer than anyone I know. He's polite, quiet, and very particular about what he tells people, which is why I remember this. It happened in March last year, on a Thursday evening. I was outside checking the goats before dark when I noticed 2 children standing at the fence on the north side of my property. They were on the other side of the fence, right where the trees began. A boy and a girl, I'd guess 8 and 10 years old. My first thought was that they belonged to my neighbor, maybe grandchildren visiting, maybe they'd wandered over. Nothing about the situation seemed dangerous. But the closer I got, the stranger it felt. They weren't wearing coats. It was a cold March evening, and the ground was wet. Their clothes were completely clean. Not just clean, perfectly clean. No mud around the cuffs, no grass stains, no dirt on their shoes. They looked like children who had never actually walked through the field they were standing in. I stopped at the fence. "Hey, are you all right?" Neither answered. I tried again. "Where are your parents?" The boy raised one hand. He pointed into the trees behind him. Just one finger, slowly. He didn't look toward the trees. He looked at me. I turned around to see what he was pointing at. There was nothing there. Just trees, darkness between the trunks. I looked back. The boy was still pointing. And that's when I felt something I couldn't explain. I wanted to leave. Not because I thought the children were dangerous. Because something about them made me want to be inside my house before it got completely dark. I told them it was getting cold. I told them they should go home. Then I turned around. I walked back toward the house. I didn't run. I didn't look back. Not until I reached my porch. The fence line was empty. The children were gone. I stood there for several seconds, waiting to hear them. Nothing. And that shouldn't have been possible. The ground was still partially frozen. My own footsteps had been loud. 2 children walking away through that grass and frozen ground should have made some sound. But there was nothing. I went inside. About 40 minutes later, I drove down to my neighbor's house. I told him what I'd seen. He looked confused. Then he asked me what the children looked like. I described them. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he told me his grandchildren were all in Charleston that week. There hadn't been any children visiting. I asked him if someone else might have been on the property. He said no. Then he said something I didn't understand. His grandfather had seen children near that same fence line. More than once. I asked when. He said, "Over the years, that's all." Then he added, "My grandfather always said not to invite them closer." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He said there was one more thing. If they point at something, don't follow where they're pointing. I laughed a little because I didn't know what else to do. He didn't laugh. The next morning he called me. He said everything on his property was fine. Then he asked me if I'd noticed anything unusual about the children. I told him I'd already described them. He said no, he meant something else. He asked if they had made any sound. I thought about it. They hadn't, not once. No greeting, no crying, no breathing that I could hear. Nothing. He said his grandfather had described them the same way. Always quiet, always clean, always standing near the fence, and always pointing toward the trees. I asked him what was in those trees. He said he didn't know. I asked him what his grandfather thought the children were. He said his grandfather never called them children. That was the first time I felt genuinely cold. I asked what he called them. My neighbor said he didn't. Then he changed the subject. I haven't seen them since. but I still check the northern fence every evening. And I've noticed something I didn't notice before. There are places where the grass along that fence grows differently. Two narrow patches, about the width of children's shoes. They run from the fence toward the trees. I've never found footprints in them, just flattened grass, two parallel paths, as though something has been standing there repeatedly, waiting. The strangest part is that I don't know whether I'm checking the fence because I don't want to see those children again, or because some part of me is afraid that one evening I'll look out there and they'll be gone from the fence, and this time they'll be standing closer to my house. If they ever point at something again, I already know what I'm going to do. I'm not looking, I'm not following, and whatever is waiting in those trees can keep waiting. Story 2. My grandmother had one rule about the ridge above our community. She never explained it. She just said that whatever lived up there had been there longer than any family in the valley, and that we had learned to live beside it by respecting the distance. I was 12 when she first told me that. At the time, I thought it was one of those strange mountain sayings adults used to keep children from wandering around after dark. Years later, I stopped thinking that. Cannon Ridge was barely a town. Maybe 200 people if you counted the scattered farms. We had a church, a volunteer fire department, a general store, and a post office. Everything else required a 45-minute drive. My grandmother had lived there her entire life. She wasn't superstitious. That mattered. She believed in things she could see, measure, repair, or plant. If she told you something was real, you listened. She once told me there was something on the ridge. Not an animal, not a person, something. And she said there was an understanding. It stayed on the ridge. We stayed below. As long as everyone respected the boundary, there was no problem. I forgot about that conversation for years. Then I came home after a failed job in Pittsburgh. My parents were still living at the house where I'd grown up. Our nearest neighbor was an older woman named Darlene Mutters. Darlene had lived alone for as long as I could remember. Her husband had died in a tractor accident 15 years earlier. After that, she kept one yellow porch light burning every night, dusk to dawn, every night. My mother used to say Darlene left it on for Carl. Nobody questioned it. Until one evening, my mother mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. Darlene's porch light was off. Not just that night, it had been off for 3 nights. My mother looked genuinely worried. I asked why. She said, "Because Darlene never turns that light off." The next morning, I walked up to her house. She answered the door holding a coffee mug. She looked perfectly healthy. I asked if everything was all right. She smiled. Then she said she'd decided it was time to stop leaving the light on. I asked why. She didn't answer. That night, I was sitting outside smoking when I noticed a light moving on the ridge above her property. At first, I assumed it was someone hunting. But the movement was wrong. It wasn't sweeping across the trees. It moved in a slow circle, around the perimeter of something. Then it stopped. It stayed still for several minutes and disappeared. 2 days later, Darlene's car was gone. Her chickens hadn't been fed. My mother called the sheriff. No forced entry, no struggle, nothing missing. Then, 11 days later, Darlene came home. She looked exhausted. She wouldn't talk to me. A week later, my mother visited her. When she came home, I asked what had happened. My mother wouldn't tell me everything, but she told me enough. Darlene had turned off the porch light because something on the hill had started coming toward it. Night after night, she couldn't see it clearly. She only knew it was getting closer. So she turned the light off, then she left. She stayed with a friend until she believed enough time had passed. I asked my mother why Darlene turned the light back on when she returned. My mother said something I'll never forget. She'd rather know where it is. 5 months later, I saw it. It was January, cold enough that the windows were frozen around the edges. I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I was sitting in the dark looking across the road. Darlene's porch light was on, a small yellow circle on the snow, and at the very edge of that circle was a shape, upright, still. I couldn't make out a face, couldn't tell if it had clothes, couldn't tell how tall it was, but it was there, standing exactly where the light ended. I watched for nearly 20 minutes. It never stepped forward, it never stepped back, it simply stood at the boundary. Then I went to bed. The next morning, there were no footprints in the snow, none, not one. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, sleep deprivation, distance, a tree, anything. But I kept thinking about Darlene. She had kept that light burning for 15 years. Maybe it wasn't a memorial for her husband. Maybe it was a marker, a line, a statement. This is where your darkness ends. This is where my house begins. I moved away 8 months later. The porch light was still burning when I left. And sometimes I think about that little yellow circle, because I don't think Darlene was trying to keep the darkness away. I think she was showing it exactly how far it was allowed to come. Story 3. I have driven the same roads in McCreary County, Kentucky for years. I'm a home health aide. My clients live in places where the roads have names but sometimes barely qualify as roads. I know where the potholes are. I know which bends flood. I know where the cell signal disappears. I know which roads become dangerous after dark. That's why I still can't explain what happened on the Lower Creek Road. It was late October, about 6:30 in the evening. The sun had already disappeared behind the hills. I was driving home from my last client when I saw a man standing in the middle of the road. He was about 200 yards ahead of me. At first I assumed he'd had car trouble. There was no vehicle. I slowed down. He was standing with his back toward me, dark clothes, hands at his sides, completely still. I stopped about 30 feet away. I lowered the window. "Sir, you need help?" Nothing. I tried again. No response. I could hear the creek beside the road. I could hear my engine. I could hear everything except the man. I honked once. He moved his head, not toward me, toward the creek, as if he'd heard something there. Then he turned his head forward again. I waited. He didn't move for almost 3 minutes. Then he started walking, straight down the center of my lane. I followed slowly. He never looked back. He never moved toward the shoulder. He never acknowledged the vehicle behind him. After maybe 100 yards, he turned left, toward the creek. He walked directly into the darkness. I expected to hear water, a splash, something. There was nothing. He simply disappeared. I pulled over. I got out. I shined my phone toward the creek. Nobody. The bank was empty. The water was moving slowly. There was no person in it, no vehicle, no flashlight, nothing. I drove home much faster than I normally would. The next morning I told my supervisor. She listened. She didn't laugh. She didn't tell me I'd imagined it. She simply asked which road. Then she marked it as a nighttime caution route for staff. I haven't driven it after dark since. I've told the story several times. People always ask me the same question. Was it a ghost? I don't know. And honestly, I think that's the wrong question. The question I keep asking is, what was he doing? He wasn't wandering. He wasn't lost. He wasn't trying to get help. He was standing in the road as if he expected someone to come. Then he walked toward the creek and disappeared. I've thought about that last part more than anything else, because the creek was only about 30 feet from the road. There was no reason to walk into it, unless he knew something about that creek that I didn't. A few weeks later, I mentioned the incident to one of my older clients. I didn't give him the details. I just asked if he'd ever heard stories about someone appearing on that road. He looked at me. Then he asked, "Which part?" I told him. He stared at me for a long time. Then he said his father used to warn him not to stop on that road after dark. I asked why. He said his father never explained, just said that if you saw someone standing in the road, you kept driving. I asked what happened if they wouldn't move. He looked toward the window. Then he said, "Don't follow them when they leave the road." I didn't tell him that was exactly what had happened to me. I didn't need to. He already knew. I still drive that road in daylight. In the daytime, it's completely ordinary. Trees, creek, gravel, nothing unusual. But I've learned something about those hollows. A place can look harmless in daylight. That doesn't mean it stays the same after dark. And if I ever see that man standing in the road again, I won't stop. I won't call out. I won't honk. And if he turns toward the creek, I'm going the other way. Story 4. My cousin Terrell told me never to cross the old fort after dark. The strange thing is, he'd never told me that before. I'd known him my whole life. He'd lived in Cutter's Ford, Kentucky, his entire life. I'd spent summers there as a kid. We both knew the creek. We both knew the old crossing. And somehow, I had never heard the rule. The old ford was about 3/4 of a mile downstream from the main bridge. There used to be a road there. By the time I was an adult, it was mostly gone. Only an overgrown track remained. Terrell used the area for hunting. He told me he'd had a strange experience there twice. The first time, he'd been crossing the creek at night. The water was only ankle deep. He heard footsteps upstream, heavy footsteps. Coming toward him through the water, he called out. The footsteps stopped. Nothing answered. He crossed and went home. 3 weeks later, he was crossing the same place before dawn. The water was higher. He was halfway across when something came around the bend. Terrell stopped telling the story for a moment. Then he said, "It wasn't walking." He described something tall and thin, moving along the far bank. Its body was low, its movement was almost a limp. But it wasn't injured, it wasn't crawling. It wasn't an animal he'd ever seen. It moved parallel to him. Then it stopped and looked at him. He couldn't see its face, but he knew it was watching. He crossed the creek and didn't hear it follow. After that, he stopped using the ford. He took the bridge. I asked him why he'd never told me the old crossing had a reputation. He said he'd never heard about it either, not until after his second encounter. That's when he'd spoken to an elderly man named Burl. Burl had lived along the creek his entire life. When Terrell described what he'd seen, Burl didn't seem surprised. He simply asked, "You crossed at night?" Terrell said yes. Burl shook his head. Then he said, "People around here don't do that. Not because the water was dangerous, not because of snakes, not because the old crossing was unstable. They simply didn't cross there after dark. It had always been that way. The rule had existed for generations. Nobody remembered why." Terrell told me that after hearing this, he drove out to the ford in daylight. He stood on the bank. The creek looked completely ordinary. Clear water, smooth stones, trees moving in the afternoon wind. He stood there for a while. Then he said something to the empty woods. He doesn't remember the exact words, but the meaning was simple. He told whatever lived there that he understood, that he would stay on the bridge from then on. He said, the moment he finished speaking, the strange unease he'd carried for weeks seemed to lift. He didn't know why, neither do I. But I've thought about that story many times. Because the frightening part isn't that Terrell saw something. The frightening part is that an entire community had already developed a rule about that place, long before he knew what the rule was for. Something happened there often enough that people stopped asking questions. They simply learned. Don't cross the ford after dark. Take the bridge. Don't find out why. I've never crossed it. I don't intend to. And sometimes I wonder how many other places in those mountains have rules like that. Rules nobody remembers the reason for anymore. Rules that survived because someone, somewhere, learned the reason the hard way, and then made sure their children didn't have to. Story 5. The first warning didn't come from a person. It came from the deer. I lived for 2.5 years in Scott County, Virginia, in the mountains near the Kentucky and Tennessee lines. I rented a house from an older couple named Earl and Doris Hensley. Their grandson Wyatt lived on the property too. He knew that mountain better than anyone I'd ever met. He knew where the water disappeared in summer, which logging roads were still usable, where the ground stayed wet, which parts of the ridge were dangerous in winter. And one November, I noticed something strange. The deer stopped behaving normally. Every evening, several of them would gather in the field below my house. They wouldn't feed, they wouldn't move. They would simply stand there, all facing uphill. At first I assumed they'd smelled a predator. That's normal. Deer smell something unfamiliar, they become alert. But this was different. They didn't run, they didn't relax, they just watched the same section of mountain. For long periods I mentioned it to Wyatt. He didn't seem surprised. He asked when I'd first noticed it. I said early November. He nodded. Then he told me something I'd never heard before. There was something on the upper part of the mountain, something that came down some winters. Not every winter. But when it did, the deer knew first. I asked what he meant. He said his grandfather had taught him about it. His grandfather had learned it from his father. The family had maintained the same rule for generations. Don't use the upper trail between November and March. I asked if it was dangerous. Wyatt thought about it. Then he said, no one in my family has ever had a bad encounter. I asked how that was an answer. He said, because nobody in my family gets close enough. That was the end of the conversation. I respected the request. I never used the upper trail. The next winter, the deer did the same thing. Early November, the same field, the same direction, the same silent attention. I started thinking of it as a seasonal event, like the first frost, except nobody wanted to explain what caused it. Then, during my final winter there, I saw something. It was February. I came home around 9 at night and sat in my car before going inside. The headlights were off, the engine was off. The field below my house was covered in frozen grass. There were 6 or 8 deer standing there, all facing uphill, every one of them. I watched them for several minutes. Then I looked toward the tree line. There was something there, a shape, tall, upright, still. It stood where the field ended and the forest began. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't a tree, it wasn't a person I could recognize. I watched it, it didn't move. Then it stepped backward, not sideways, not away along the ridge, backward, straight into the trees, and disappeared. The deer didn't run. That is what I remember most. They stood there for another few minutes. Then they calmly returned to feeding. I went inside. I never told Wyatt. I don't know why. Maybe because he had already told me everything I needed to know. The next morning I looked at the upper trail from my porch. I didn't go there, I never did. Before I moved away, Wyatt helped me load my truck. As I was leaving, he thanked me for staying off the upper trail. I told him it hadn't been difficult. He nodded. Then he said something that made me think about the deer again. Some things are easier to live beside when you don't insist on seeing them. I've remembered that sentence ever since, because I used to think fear came from seeing something you couldn't explain. Now I think sometimes fear comes from realizing that the people who live somewhere have already explained it to themselves. They just decided not to tell you. Story 6. My grandfather had a rule. He called it Granddad's Rule. He never wrote it down, he never put it on a sign. He simply told every member of the family the same thing. You did not go onto the second ridge without telling someone where you were going. And you did not stay there after dark. My grandfather grew up in Logan County, West Virginia. His family had been in that hollow since the 1870s. Mining defined the place. The men went into the mountain every morning. Sometimes the mountain gave them back. Sometimes it didn't. My grandfather lived to 93. He remembered everything. Names, dates, old properties, families who had moved away decades earlier. He remembered stories people had stopped telling. I spent a lot of time with him near the end of his life because I knew that when he died, a library of local knowledge would disappear with him. That's when he explained Granddad's Rule. He said his grandfather had learned it from the man before him. Nobody had ever written down why, but everybody followed it. When I was younger, I assumed it was about safety. The second ridge had old mine workings. There were unstable slopes, sinkholes, abandoned shafts. That was enough reason. Then, when I was 28, I asked my grandfather if the rule was simply about old mines. He looked at me. Then he said no. I asked what it was about. He said he didn't know. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He told me there was a particular place on the second ridge where people sometimes heard movement. Not animals, not machinery, movement. He had heard it himself as a boy. He described something moving through the trees when there was no wind, always above them, never approaching, never leaving, just moving. He said the first time he heard it, he wanted to go looking. His grandfather stopped him. He told him, "Don't make it curious about you." That sentence bothered me more than anything else. I asked what that meant. My grandfather said he didn't know. He said his grandfather had never explained. The rule was older than explanations. Years later, the family property was sold. One branch of the family inherited the land and didn't want it. They sold it to strangers. I didn't think much about it until I found out that the new owners had no idea about Granddad's Rule. They didn't know the second ridge was considered off limits. They didn't know the family had avoided it for generations. They had the deed, they had the property, but they didn't have the warning. That's what stayed with me, because the land didn't change when the ownership changed. Whatever had been on that ridge didn't care whose name appeared on the paperwork. The only thing that disappeared was the knowledge. A few years ago, I looked up the property records. The land had been sold twice. The current owners lived in another state. The property was listed as undeveloped acreage. I don't know if they've ever been there. I don't know if they've walked the second ridge. I don't know if they've heard anything. And I don't want to know, because my grandfather's rule wasn't really about belief. He said that himself. Belief doesn't come into it. It was about observation. Someone before him had noticed something. Someone had decided distance was safer than curiosity. That decision had survived 4 generations. Then the property was sold, and the warning ended. The land kept the secret, the family didn't. Sometimes I wonder what happens when knowledge like that disappears. Maybe nothing. Maybe the rule was always unnecessary. Maybe generations of people simply became superstitious about an old mountain. But there's another possibility. Maybe the reason the rule survived wasn't because everyone believed the same story. Maybe it survived because enough people had experienced the same thing. And nobody wanted to be the generation that stopped listening. I still remember my grandfather's final explanation. He said, "You don't have to know what something is to know where you shouldn't be." I've never forgotten that, and I don't think I ever will. Story 7. My father talked about everything. Politics, religion, other people's business, the price of cattle, road conditions. He could turn almost any subject into a 20-minute conversation. There was one exception: Sawmill Branch. Whenever we drove there, he became quiet. Not sad, watchful, like he was checking whether something was still where he expected it to be. I noticed it when I was a kid. I didn't understand it. Years later, I finally asked. He told me he'd been 12 years old when it happened. He and 2 other boys had gone up into the hills to an abandoned mine. The mine had been closed before my father was born. One opening was still large enough to enter. They went inside, only about 15 feet. Then they found evidence that something was living there. Animal bones, food remains, nesting material. But the part my father remembered wasn't the bones, it was the wall. Someone or something had scratched marks into the rock. Deep marks, deliberate marks. Not letters, not symbols he recognized. Just lines cut into stone with enough force that even a 12-year-old boy understood they hadn't happened accidentally. They left. He never told his parents. The following summer he went back. The nesting material was gone, the bones were gone, the marks remained. He never went back again, not once, for 40 years. I asked him what he thought had lived there. He said he didn't know. I asked if he thought it was an animal. He said, "Not one I'd want to meet." That was all he would say. 2 summers ago, I returned to Sawmill Branch alone. I visited the family cemetery. Then I drove toward the old mine. The road was mostly gone. I followed a pair of faint tire tracks until they ended. The mine opening itself had collapsed. There was almost nothing to see, just a depression in the hillside. I stayed in the truck. I didn't intend to climb the hill. I only wanted to see what my father had seen. The forest was completely still. Then I heard something. About 100 yards uphill. A slow movement through the undergrowth, not a deer. A deer crashes through brush when it moves quickly. This was controlled, slow, deliberate, moving across the hillside parallel to me. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it, and then it stopped. I sat there listening, nothing. Then I heard one more sound, 3 steps, slowly, from somewhere above me. I started the truck. I didn't look toward the hill again. I drove back to the main road. I didn't stop until I was out of the hollow. My father had always said the same thing. Some things in those mountains had been there before the families, before the houses, before the mines. And they weren't necessarily dangerous. They simply didn't want to be disturbed. I understand that differently now. Because when my father was 12, he found evidence that something lived inside that mountain. 40 years later, he still remembered it. And when I went looking for the place, something moved in the same woods. Maybe coincidence, maybe a deer, maybe something entirely ordinary. I can't prove otherwise. But I know what my father taught me. Don't go looking for answers just because you know where the question is. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do in the mountains is leave an old mystery exactly where you found it. Story 8. I've lived in Ashe County, North Carolina most of my life. I know those roads. I know which ones are paved, which ones dead end, which ones become impassable after rain. That's why one particular road still bothers me. I saw it in the fall of 2019. I was driving home late at night. I took a familiar route through the mountains. At one point I noticed a road turning off to the left. I had never seen it before. That wasn't impossible. Old logging roads appear and disappear all the time. So I turned. The road climbed into the trees. It was narrow. No houses, no mailboxes, no utility lines, just a dirt road disappearing uphill. After maybe half a mile, I saw a light, yellow, dim. It looked like a house lamp through trees. I kept driving. The road opened into a small clearing. There was a structure ahead. I couldn't make out what it was. But there was a door, and light coming from underneath it. I stopped. I don't know why. Something about the scene felt wrong, not dangerous. Wrong. As if I'd arrived somewhere that wasn't supposed to be there. I sat in the truck for several minutes. Then I backed up. I drove home. The next morning I went back. The road was gone. Not blocked. Not washed out. Gone. There was no entrance. Just trees. I thought I'd taken the wrong turn, so I checked the map. There had never been a road there. I went back several times, nothing. Eventually I mentioned it to an older man who had lived in the area his entire life. I described the location. He went quiet. Then he asked, "Did you see a light?" I said yes. He didn't ask what color. He already knew. He told me there were old roads in the hills that locals used to avoid. Some had reputations, some disappeared. Some were only visible under certain conditions. I asked what conditions. He said the old people knew. He didn't. Then he gave me one instruction. Keep to the main road. I asked why. He said, because some roads weren't made for cars. I laughed. He didn't. I've never seen the road again. But I still look for it. That's the part I don't understand. I know it sounds irrational. I know what I saw shouldn't exist, and yet, every time I pass that hillside at night, some part of me watches for the turnoff. Not because I want to drive it again, because I want to know if it is still there. I want to see the light. I want to know what was behind that door. That's the dangerous part of the story, not the road, the curiosity. Because if the road appears again, I already know what the old man told me. Keep driving. Don't turn, and whatever you see at the end of that road, don't open the door. Story 9. The family had lived on that mountain for generations. They knew where the deer crossed, where the water ran in summer, where the ground became unstable, which trails were safe, and one path nobody talked about. The path ended at a large boulder. That was the boundary. At least that's what Lee learned when they were 38. Lee had grown up in a small community in southwestern North Carolina. Their family had been there for 5 generations. The mountain wasn't scenery to them, it was home. Their grandfather had walked the same trails every morning for decades. One of those trails climbed from the lower pasture into the forest. Lee had walked it many times, but one autumn morning, they went farther than usual. They followed the old path uphill. Eventually, they reached the boulder. It was larger than Lee remembered. Beyond it, the trail continued, barely visible, curving into the trees. Lee had never been told not to go farther. So they stepped around the boulder, only a few yards. Then they stopped. Something was wrong. There was no sound. No birds, no insects, no wind. The forest seemed to have gone completely still. Lee looked uphill. They couldn't see anything. But they felt watched, not from one direction, from everywhere. Then they heard movement, slow, heavy, somewhere above them, not coming toward them, moving across the slope. Lee couldn't see what it was. They backed toward the boulder. The moment they stepped behind it, the feeling stopped. The forest became normal again. Birds, wind, leaves. Lee went home. Their sibling was already in the kitchen. Lee casually mentioned the boulder, then described what happened. The sibling stopped pouring coffee. They asked, the boulder or past it? Lee said they'd gone past it. The sibling nodded. That's good. Lee asked what was beyond the boulder. The sibling didn't answer immediately. Then they explained. The family had never gone beyond it. Not for generations. Their mother had told them when they were young. Her mother had told her. The rule had been passed down the family. The path ended at the boulder. The family's relationship with the mountain ended there. Whatever was above it had its own relationship with the land. A relationship that existed before the family arrived. Lee asked why nobody had told them. The siblings said they thought Lee already knew. Maybe they'd been told as a child. Maybe they'd forgotten. Maybe some warnings become instincts instead of memories. Lee hasn't gone back. They've returned to the property twice. They still walk the lower trails. They still go into the forest. But they stop at the boulder every time. And they say the strangest thing about the experience wasn't what they felt that morning. It was what happened afterward. Once Lee knew the rule, the mountain seemed different. The boulder no longer looked like a rock. It looked like a boundary. A line that had existed long before anyone thought to give it a name. That's what stayed with me when I read Lee's story, because this same pattern appears again and again in these mountain communities. A light, a creek, a trail, a ridge, a road, a place where people simply stop. And when someone asks why, the answer is often incomplete. Don't go there, don't cross after dark, don't follow, keep the light on, stay on the road. Nobody can explain everything. But the rule survives. Maybe because someone learned it the hard way. Maybe because something happened often enough that the explanation eventually became unnecessary. Or maybe because the mountains contain things that don't need to announce themselves. They only need people to respect the boundary. Lee put it better than I could. The mountain doesn't belong to the family. The family belongs to the mountain. And somewhere beyond that boulder is a part of the mountain that isn't theirs. They don't know what's there. They don't intend to find out. I think that's probably the safest kind of knowledge, knowing exactly where your curiosity is supposed to end. Story 10. The first night, I thought someone was trying to get inside. The second night, I realized they weren't trying to get inside. The third night, I heard them humming outside my bedroom window. I still don't know which possibility bothers me more. I'm a civil engineer. I've spent most of my career working on bridges, retaining walls, and road projects in remote parts of the eastern United States, so I'm not particularly interested in supernatural explanations. If something happens, my first instinct is usually to find the physical cause. That was exactly what I did when I rented a house in Mill Holler, West Virginia. I was there for 9 days doing a site assessment for a county bridge replacement project. The house belonged to a man named Glenn. It was old but comfortable, and because the owners were away for the season, I had the place to myself. The first 6 nights were completely uneventful. Then, on the 7th night, I woke up at 2:18 in the morning. I knew the exact time because I looked at my phone. At first, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. The front door knob moving, very slowly. Not someone pounding on the door, not someone trying to break in, someone testing the handle. The knob turned, stopped, turned again. Then I heard a faint rattle from the lock. I stayed in bed for several seconds. Then it happened again. 2 slow attempts. I got up, I checked the door. Locked. I checked every window. Locked. Then I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow footsteps. The porch boards creaked once, then again. I stood there, holding my flashlight, and waited. Nothing. After several minutes, I heard movement around the side of the house. A soft crunch in the gravel. Then another. Then something brushing against the siding. Whoever was outside walked around the entire house. Slowly, methodically. They went past every window, every door, then stopped. I stayed awake until morning. At sunrise, I walked around the property. The ground was soft enough in places to leave prints. There were shoe prints, normal shoes, not boots, not bare feet. Someone had walked around the entire house. I called Glenn. I told him what happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if anything had been stolen. I said no. He told me there was a man in the holler who sometimes had problems. He said he'd handle it. That answer bothered me. I asked what kind of problems. Glenn didn't answer. He just said, "It won't happen again." I wanted to believe him. The 8th night was completely quiet. No footsteps. No door. Nothing. I started thinking I'd overreacted. Then came the 9th night, my last night. I woke up at about 3:40. No sound had woken me. I just suddenly became completely awake. I lay there in the darkness, and then I heard something outside my bedroom window, a quiet sound, almost musical. It took me several seconds to identify it. Someone was humming very softly. They weren't walking, they weren't moving around. They were standing directly outside my bedroom window. The humming, the tune was unfamiliar, but the rhythm was calm, almost casual, like someone humming while doing a chore around the house. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't look through the window. I just listened. The humming continued for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped. No footsteps followed. No door opened. No gravel moved. Nothing. I stayed in bed until sunrise. Then I packed my things. I finished my work and left. I've told this story to people since then. Almost everyone gives me the same explanation. Some local person, someone unstable, someone wandering around at night, and that is possible. I can't prove otherwise. But there's one part of that explanation I can't make fit. The behavior. Whoever was outside wasn't confused. They weren't stumbling around. They weren't banging on doors. They didn't behave randomly. They walked around the house in a complete circuit. They checked the windows. They tested the door. Then, the next night, they stood outside one particular bedroom and hummed. That isn't random behavior. It's organized. It's deliberate. It follows a pattern. And that is what bothers me. Because if it was a person, I don't know what they wanted. And if it wasn't a person, I don't know what rules they were following. I've never contacted Glenn again. I never asked what he meant when he said he'd take care of it. Maybe he knew exactly who had been outside that house. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I've learned one thing from that experience. When you're staying in a remote house, a locked door is useful. But it only protects you from things that believe a locked door is a boundary. Whatever was outside that house seemed to understand boundaries perfectly. It just didn't seem to care that the house wasn't its own. And I've never forgotten the last thing I heard. Not the footsteps, not the door handle, the humming, because it sounded like whoever was standing outside my window was completely comfortable being there, as if they had done it before, as if they knew I was listening, and as if they weren't waiting for me to come outside. They were simply waiting for morning. Story 11. The photograph wasn't supposed to prove anything. It was just a disposable camera picture taken by 4 teenagers who thought they were being brave. But when the film came back, there was something in the window, and what frightened me wasn't seeing it. It was realizing that we'd heard it before we saw it. This happened when I was 16 in Mingo County, West Virginia. At the end of Slate Lick Road was an abandoned farmhouse that had belonged to the Brewer family. Nobody had lived there for decades. The house was still standing, but barely. The paint had faded. The porch sagged. The windows were boarded up. The property was surrounded by weeds and an old rusted gate. Naturally, every teenager in the area had heard stories about it. Some said the house was haunted. Some said someone had died inside. Some said you could hear footsteps upstairs if you went there at night. We didn't believe any of it. We were 16. That was enough explanation. One summer night, 4 of us decided to drive out there. Me, my friend Cassie, Dylan, and Renee. We arrived around 9:30. The gate wasn't locked. That should have been our first warning. We walked up the lane. The house looked worse up close. One of the porch boards cracked when Dylan stepped on it. We stopped. Nobody wanted to go inside anymore, so we decided we'd walk around the outside and leave. Cassie took pictures with a disposable camera. We were laughing, making jokes, trying to scare each other. Then we reached the back of the house. Renee suddenly grabbed Dylan's arm. She pointed upward. There was a second-floor window. Most of the windows in the house were broken or boarded. This one wasn't. There was something standing behind it. At first I thought it was furniture, a chair, maybe a coat hanging from something. Then it moved. It was standing upright, looking down at us. Nobody said anything. We just stared. Then it took one step backward, into the darkness, gone. We left immediately. Nobody ran. We were too embarrassed to run, but we moved fast. We didn't speak until we were back inside Dylan's truck. Renee finally asked, "What was that?" Nobody answered, because none of us knew. 10 days later, Cassie got the pictures developed. She brought them to my house. Most were ordinary. The front of the house, the collapsed shed, the porch, the weeds. Then we reached the photograph she'd taken from behind the house. The window was visible, and there was something standing in it. The picture wasn't clear enough to identify the shape, but it was definitely there, an upright figure, exactly where we'd seen it. Cassie kept the photograph. She still has it. But there's something I didn't tell anyone that night, not even Cassie. Just before Renee pointed at the window, I heard something inside the house. One footstep, then another, wooden floorboards, slow, deliberate, then silence. At the time I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses make noises. I didn't want to be the person who made everyone panic, so I said nothing. But years later, I thought about the sequence. First I heard footsteps, then we saw the figure. And the figure didn't appear suddenly. It moved toward the window. It had been somewhere inside the room. It came to the window. It looked down at us. Then it stepped backward. That means it knew we were there, before we knew it was there. That's the part I can't explain away. If we'd simply seen a strange shape in an abandoned window, maybe I'd have forgotten about it. Maybe it was a person. Maybe someone was hiding in the house. Maybe there was some completely ordinary explanation. But the footsteps changed the story. Something was moving inside the house. It heard us. It came to the window. It watched us. Then it moved away. We were not simply observing something. Something was observing us. A few years ago, I asked Cassie if she had ever gone back. She said no. I asked why. She said, "Because the picture is enough." I understood what she meant. You don't always need to know what something was. Sometimes knowing that it was there is enough. The Brewer house was eventually torn down. The property was cleared. The weeds were cut. The old gate disappeared. There's almost nothing left. But Cassie still has that photograph. And I've never asked to see it again. Because I remember the window. I remember the figure, and more than anything, I remember those 2 footsteps coming from inside the house. The thing in the window didn't surprise me nearly as much as the possibility that